Be a live reading of my manuscript. So this is going to be the prologue and chapter 1. Hope you enjoy it. Chapter 1 and the prologue. Unbound. Free for life. How a man went from burning alive to burning alive. Being alive. To Frogs and Roses. I was not listening to someone else's voice. I was looking for mine. There's a question that sounds simple until it lands in front of you, and then it becomes the most honest mirror that you've ever stood in front of. I was in an online writing cohort, one of those attempts to get out of the rooms that had always defined me and find something that was actually mine, when the facilitator offered this prompt. Not a theological question, not a leadership challenge, something smaller and more dangerous than either of these. Just this. If you could send a postcard to a close friend, one picture, no words, to show them who you are, what would you draw? I did not know. And I wanted to stay there for a moment in that not knowing, because it is more important than anything that came after it. I'd spent the better part of my adult life in rooms that told me exactly who I was. I had a title, a role, expectations I'd learned to carry so long they felt like posture. And none of that helped me answer a question a child could have answered without thinking twice. But to understand what that moment meant, I have to go back 8 months. September of 2022. I was sitting with my therapist doing the kind of work that asks more of you than most people are willing to give, when she looked at me and asked the question I was completely unprepared for. James, who are you? I answered the way I'd answered that question my entire life. I gave her the resume, the roles, the years, the accomplishments, the titles. I gave her the bloom, every petal of it, arranged carefully, presented honestly, because I genuinely believed that was the answer. She let me finish, and then she said quietly, the way people say things that change the direction of everything. No, who are you without all of that? I did not have an answer. At this time, I'd spent 26 years in ministry, decades in rooms full of people who needed me to know, and I sat in that chair with nothing underneath the titles. Not because I was empty, but because I'd never been asked to look. The rooms had always handed me the answer before the question could fully form. Pastor, leader, teacher. The one who knows, the one who helps. Put the uniform on and the question disappears. She did not let the question disappear. I carried it for 8 months, through every room I walked into, every role I occupied, every conversation where someone looked at me like I had it together. The question hung around my neck like something I could not put down and could not yet answer. Who are you without all of that? And then one afternoon, in an online writing cohort, that facilitator asked me to draw a postcard. The facilitator moved on. The cohort kept breathing. And I sat there in the particular stillness of a man who has just discovered a gap he did not know existed. It was not a dramatic moment from the outside. Nobody knew. That is the thing about these moments. They are invisible to everyone in the room because the room is always watching the bloom. Nobody sees the root shift. But I knew something had happened because the question would not leave, even as the session continued, even as other voices filled the space with their answers. Beautiful answers, confident answers, answers that sounded like people who had been introduced to themselves long before that afternoon. I was somewhere else entirely. I was standing in front of something I could not name, and it was standing back. The facilitator came back around and offered an extension of the prompt. What if you wrote it instead? Poem, prose, anything. Just let it come. I did not plan what happened next. I did not outline or consider or carefully construct. I put my hands on the keys and wrote without breathing, word after word, arriving the way things arrive when they're not invented but uncovered. And when my hands stopped, I looked at what was on the screen, and I knew, the way you know things that live below thought, that this was not something I had made. This was something I had finally found. When the facilitator asked if anyone wanted to share, my hand went up before the question finished, and in my deepest voice, the one that carries the full weight of my life, my soul dripping with something I could only describe as recognition, my heart loud in my chest, my eyes wide open, I read these words. A rose, strong, vibrant, centered, open, fully bloomed, receiving the eyes and attention of others, absorbing the morning dews as new ideas of a created world ready to be discovered. Beside this vibrant bloom are closed buds, ready to be understood, heard, and seen. But ultimately, we know that there are those blooms long gone, brittle stems of what used to be, and all these guarded by a stem with thorns that transcend life itself, holding the fragile together, a friend. But the root is what I do not show, the source, the life, the breath from which it all flows. This is me. I am in the soil. The flower is my life, my voice, my mind. May it grow for others to be empowered to rise from their own place from the earth and live. When I finished, the room was quiet. Not the quiet of confusion, not the polite quiet of people searching for something kind to say. The quiet of people who had just heard something true. And I sat there looking at the screen, seeing myself as I had always been, as I had perhaps always known in some place too deep for language, unfinished, unbound, and unknown. For now. I want to tell you something that I've never said cleanly in any room, to any audience in any form. I was not lost. I know that's the story that people expect here. The man who spent decades in ministry and bound to roles that never quite fit, sitting in a writing cohort trying to find himself, finally having the breakthrough. That is a tidy story. It is recognizable shape. People know how to receive it, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I was never lost. I was always there in the soil, steady, present, alive, generating everything that was growing above me, every bloom and every bud and every brittle stem that had ever been part of my life. The root was never missing. The root does not go missing. That is not what roots do. What happened was simpler and more devastating than being lost. I'd forgotten to visit myself. Not because I was negligent or dishonest or spiritually shallow, but because the rooms I'd lived in for 26 years were extraordinarily good at keeping my attention on the surface, on the bloom, on what was visible and useful and needed and presentable. The rooms did not mean harm. Most of them were full of people I genuinely loved and who loved me genuinely. But rooms have needs, and when a room needs your bloom, it does not ask about your root. It does not even know to ask. It just keeps receiving what you offer and calling it relationship. And so you learn, slowly over years, to live at the surface of yourself. You learn to answer the question before it finishes forming. You learn to reach for the resume and the role, the title, the history, the accomplishments, the version of you that the room already recognizes and already needs. You learn to wear the uniform so naturally that some mornings you forget you put it on. And then someone asks you to draw a postcard and the room goes quiet inside you. And you realize that you've been so busy tending the flower that you've not stood in the soil in longer than you can remember. This is not a pastoral story. This is not a ministry story. This is not even my story. That is yours. I do not know what your uniform is called, and I do not know which room fitted you for it, or how long you've been wearing it, or whether it feels like yours or always felt like something you inherited from someone else's expectation. But I know this. Somewhere underneath the bloom, you show the world. Underneath the roles you have learned to carry, underneath the titles and the history and the careful tended surface of a life that looks from the outside like it has everything figured out, there is a root. It has been there the whole time. It is still there now, and it is the most alive thing about you. I don't have you a program to hand to you at the end of this. Not yet, not here. What I have is the question the poem asked of me, the same question my therapist placed around my neck that I carried for 8 months before a single afternoon cracked it open. And I'm offering it to you the way it was offered to me, not as an exercise, not as a technique, as a genuine and honest mirror. If you could send a postcard to someone who truly loved you, one picture, no words, to show them who you actually are, not who you perform, not who the room needs you to be, not the resume, not the role, but who you actually are underneath all of it, what would you draw? Sit with that. Do not rush toward an answer. The rushing is the uniform talking, the mask making. The not knowing is the most honest place you have stood in a long time, and it deserves more than a quick response, because somewhere in the sitting, in the quiet underneath the question, you'll begin to feel something, not an idea, not a plan, something older than both of those, the root, recognizing itself. That is where this work begins. Not in a framework, not in a program, not in anything I can hand you from the outside. It begins in the soil, in the place you do not show, in the source, the life, the breath from which it all flows. You have always been there. It is time to go home. Part 1, the wait. Chapter 1, the slow erosion. Foundations do not collapse. That's the first thing to understand. The collapse is loud and sudden, and it gives you something to point to, a date, a cause, a single catastrophic event that you can name when people ask, what happened? Foundations do not do you that courtesy. Foundations erode. They give way one grain at a time, so slowly and so quietly that you can stand on a structure that has already lost its ability to hold and feel nothing wrong at all. Right up until the afternoon, the floor is simply no longer there. I lived on an eroding foundation for years and felt the floor as solid the entire time. That is not a failure of intelligence. I'm not a stupid man. It is the particular blindness of someone whose entire sense of himself is built upon holding things up. You cannot feel the ground washing out when every ounce of your attention is fixed on keeping the people standing on top of you from falling. The erosion began, if I have to mark a year, in 2018. My mother-in-law died, and she died in the way the worst losses come, without warning, without the mercy of a season to prepare. One day she was part of the architecture of our lives, and the next she was a hole in it. The grief moved into our home, and it did not leave. There's more to say here, and I'll continue